what causes obesity? Well, insulin does. And they're like, no, you hear it often enough that you just believe it without actually thinking critically about it. If your insulin is too high, you have to...
Jason Fung is a nephrologist from Toronto, Canada.
The author of the book, The Obesity Code, Unlocking the Secrets of Weight Loss.
And co-founder of the fasting method.
You know, I think that the metaphorical bruises you held for all of us for the attack you got.
You know, I talk about these things which seem so self-evident, and yet everybody's still trying to say, no, but this. How does that make any sense at all?
When I was learning about the ketogenic diet in 2014 and 2015, I felt lonely. Like, does anybody else see that this is how this is connected? And I actually bought the video deck from a conference that was in Cape Town, South Africa. And one of the lecturers was Jason Fung. He actually was talking about the thyroid process that in medical school and in residency, we had all been taught once you have thyroid disease, that's going to be there forever. And then that answer's done. I know that answer. I don't need to learn that again. And patients on the ketogenic diet were reversing their thyroid problems. And I mean, they would say, Doc, I haven't taken my thyroid medication in, 4 months. And I'm like, why did you stop that? And I was a little, accusatory. And by golly, their thyroid meds were gone. They were not measurable in their blood, but they also had normal thyroid function. This had been about 6 to 8 months after being on the ketogenic diet. And as this happened to a couple of people, and I didn't have a place in my mind. Every doctor I asked said, that's crazy, that doesn't happen. And then Jason Fung talked about it in that slide deck. From that moment on, I became a super fan, saying, oh, he is seeing and talking about the same stuff that I'm seeing. And it's with that introduction that I share with you. Our guest today is Jason Fung, coming to us after hospital rounds and before a clinic filled with dialysis patients this afternoon. Thanks for taking the time for being with us.
Thank you so much.
10 years of seeing patients. That's about how long I've been doing this. I wonder if you could maybe even just talk about being one of the first physicians that said, hey, there's some logical things here that the stopping of eating isn't so strange. And maybe what things you've seen unfold in 10 years of being a physician on the front lines who also talks on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what I've talked about hasn't changed a lot. There's a couple of things that, I always thought was strange, right? So I focused a lot on hyperinsulinemia, which is sort of excess insulin. And to me, it always seems strange that people don't sort of go, okay, well, that seems kind of logical, right? Because it's like, okay, if you give insulin to anybody, they gain weight. That's pretty obvious. And I'm not sure why, but nobody really sees that as a causal factor, right? It's like, everybody's like, what causes obesity? It's like, well, insulin does. And they're like, no. I'm like, what are you talking about? If you give insulin, people gain weight. It doesn't matter like what diet you're following. It doesn't matter how much willpower you have. It doesn't matter how old or young you are. You gain weight. It just happens because it's a hormone. Its job is to tell you to store more fat, right? Because that's what its job is. And if it's too high, then it does too much, just like thyroid, right? I'm not saying thyroid, hormone is bad, but too much is bad and too little is bad. Insulin's the same. Too much is bad, too little is bad. So, and I don't understand why nobody says, okay, well, that's totally logical. Because whenever you're looking for a causal relationship, it's very easy. If you give one thing and something happens, that's a cause. Insulin's not the only cause, but it is a cause. So therefore, if it is a cause in a lot of people, then you should lower it. And the thing is that it seems strange to me because it's like, to me, that's a perfectly logical jump. That is, give insulin, weight gain. Almost universal. So therefore, insulin causes weight gain. I'm not saying it's the only thing that causes weight gain, but it is a thing that causes weight gain. So therefore, if it's too high, then you should lower it. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to me to be that difficult. And yet, lots of people, lots of experts and, official this and that, right? Associations and doctors and stuff. People think they're so smart. They're like, no, it's about calories. Like, okay, well, it overlaps, right? Because if you eat one food and you eat twice as much of that food, it's going to have twice as much insulin effect. But certain foods have more insulin effect, certain foods have less. That means some foods are more fattening than other foods. And that doesn't seem to me to be a logical stretch either. But at the same time, so many people attack me for saying stuff like that. It's like, what? I'm just saying that cookies are more fattening than broccoli. To me, it's logical. They're like, no, 100 calories of cookies is as fattening as 100 calories of broccoli. I'm like, who gets fat eating broccoli? Like, tell me, show me. Like, do you live in the real world here? But there's all these, especially these bro scientists, right? Who are all like, oh, it's all about calories because, because they're fit and so on. They see that as their evidence of their moral superiority over you, right? And that's their whole ego trip, right? But the whole thing to me seems strange that the sort of medical authorities, like the regular doctors and stuff, don't just see like the logic of it. You give insulin, people gain weight. You give drugs that stimulate insulin, you gain weight, right? Sulfonylureas. You give a drug that doesn't increase insulin, but increases insulin effect, like the TZDs, that causes weight gain, right? You take drug, if you have too little insulin, you lose weight, like type 1 diabetes, right? Like, how is that not a causal effect, right? GLP-1s, which lower insulin, same thing, right? Because they say, yes, it stimulates response to insulin, but because of the nausea, you get much, much lower insulin levels, right? Like you're shooting them down so low. And that causes it. SGLT2s, they lower insulin because you're peeing out the sugar and you're lowering insulin levels and you're losing weight, right? Like, how is that not obvious? Same thing with type 2 diabetes. It's a disease of too much insulin. How do I know? Well, everybody who has type 2 diabetes has sky high insulin levels, right? It's like, okay, well, this is not so hard to understand. There's your link between obesity and type 2 diabetes. Why are they linked? Because they're both diseases of too much insulin, right? Like, if you don't take that, then how do you think that they're linked, right? It's like, it doesn't make any sense otherwise. So if it's too high, then you lower it. And that to me is like so logical. So it's a little bit, so it's always frustrating that I talk about these things which seem so self-evident and obvious and scientifically and logically sort of straightforward. And yet everybody's still trying to say, no, but this, no, but this. You can't do this. I mean, there's people who are trying to advance. And so David Ludwig's talking a lot about the carbohydrate insulin model, which I think is, pretty close to what I'm talking about, right? Insulin being a key factor, carbohydrates contributing, right? But it's still strange to me a decade on that something which seems like obvious.
I think that the metaphorical bruises you held for all of us for the attack you got, which was at the beginning, saying things you're like, yes, that's what I see. This is what I see. And then the onslaught that you can't tell them to, you've only got three options. If you can't tell them to increase fat by decreasing those carbohydrates and get any kind of sense that you're being a good doctor. You are evil. This is awful. When Sarah Holbrook, I think, also kind of broke the glass ceiling of saying the words, diabetes is reversible. And again, in my textbooks, that was not the case. You were going to be a diabetic. Once you got there, seeing it undo was like, that's not a thing. Where do you stand on, do you see in your trajectory of people can you reverse them once they get diabetes?
Oh, totally. It's a totally reversible disease. And that's what I wrote about in the Diabetes Code, which was funny because, again, published in 2018. I talked about it a little bit at that Cape Town conference about how it's really a reversible disease of hyperinsulinemia. So you lower the insulin and you reverse the disease because the disease was about too much insulin, right? And that was the whole idea, is that, if your body has too much glucose, then you can reverse it, right? You simply eat less glucose, right? Again, the whole thing is just so mind-boggling sometimes, right? So think about it for a second. So you have type 2 diabetes, and let's just take what we know. So you know that if you have type 2 diabetes, your blood glucose is too high. That's obvious, right? Some foods raise your blood glucose. We know that from the glycemic index, right? You eat bread, your blood glucose will skyrocket. You eat an egg, it won't, because we know that the glycemic index only applies to carbohydrate containing foods. Why? Because if you don't contain carbs, it goes nowhere. It's a zero, right? So beef has a glycemic index of zero. So, okay. So we know that some foods raise your blood glucose. Why? Why is it carbs? Well, carbs are glucose. That's just their chemical structure. The starch, which is bread and rice and potatoes, is amylopectin or amylose, either of which are long chains of glucose. So you eat carbs, you're eating glucose, which raises your blood glucose. You eat an egg, which contains no glucose. It contains amino acids and fats. But an egg has no glucose. It doesn't raise your blood glucose. Okay, not so hard to understand. So here's the thing that boggles my mind. So we tell people to make sure that 50 to 60% of their diet is carbohydrates, which will spike their blood glucose, even though we know their blood glucose is too high. Like, how does that make any sense at all? Like, you don't have to be a doctor. Anybody who has any sense of logic will say, okay, I should eat foods that don't spike my blood glucose. So then, and then people talk about CGMs, and there's a huge backlash against people using CGMs. I'm like, what the hell? How is this? Like, why wouldn't you want to know these things, right?
And the feedback, right?
Bloody bizarre. Like they're saying, oh, you shouldn't use it if you're not a diabetic. I'm like, why the hell not? It's just a piece of information. Yeah, exactly. It's like a home blood pressure monitor. Was there a huge backlash about home blood pressure monitors? Maybe people will know their blood pressure, and why is that a bad thing, right? So same as blood glucose. So people know what happens to your blood glucose after certain foods. How is that a bad thing? I just don't understand. But there's a huge backlash. It just boggles my mind. Like sometimes I'm just so like flabbergasted sometimes.
I have kids now 18, 21, and 23. And we talk about common sense in our family about what were you thinking? Like put those thoughts in order. And we mandate that you figure out some of this common sense before you launch out of our home, which for us is officially happening in about a month, that they'll all be in their college seasons of life. And I often find that the logic is missing as a primary care physician. When I'm taking care of a diabetic and I tell them all right, we're going to lower your carbohydrates. We're going to reverse your diabetes. We're going to do our best to reverse your diabetes. And then we get to that word, the F word. We tell them to skip food for 36 hours, or something that is, maybe that's not where they start out at the beginning, but when we step over this threshold and say, all right, if you're actually going to reverse this, you do have to push the no button, the nothing burger, longer than what somebody who doesn't have diabetes might need to do. So why don't you just tell the story of how you first started recommending that and some of the pushback that, I still get when I say it to diabetics that are managed by other nephrologists.
Yeah, it was quite a strange thing because remember, at the time, of course, the diabetes associations were all saying you need to eat like 10 times a day and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, and the thing is, I guess what happens is you hear it often enough that you just believe it without actually thinking critically about it. And so that's why I said, okay, well, when I started to think about it, again, I just don't understand why it's not obvious. So if your blood glucose is high and you don't eat, well, your body is going to burn that glucose, right? So why wouldn't you want that? Right? I just don't understand. People say, you have to eat. I'm like, why? Why do you have to eat? Because you want to raise your blood glucose a bit more, right? Even though it's like through the roof already. The whole thing is just like it just doesn't make any sense. So when I started to say it, of course, people were like, "Oh, how can you do that? How can you do that?" But then, the key is to do it safely, right? It's like you got to monitor, right? You got to make sure you're safe. And it's no different than anything else. If you take blood pressure pill, you got to make sure it doesn't go too low. That's just obvious. Doesn't mean we rail and rail and rail against blood pressure medications because it's too high. You want to lower it, but you don't want to go too low. Obvious. It's sugars. It's too high. You want to lower it. You don't want to go too low. Obvious. Like that's just basic medicine. But of course, people encountering something out of their sort of usual range of thinking, they tend to get on you. And the endocrinologists, honestly, were the worst of all because to them, they were all like, well, I am an expert in diabetes. And if I didn't come up with it, it's obviously stupid, right? That was their entire sort of way of thinking. So most of them were not receptive at all. And that's why they've been completely left behind, honestly. It's like, yeah, I hear tons of people come up to me and they say, "Oh, thanks so much. I read your book or I saw you on YouTube. I was able to reverse my diabetes." I'm like, "Yeah." And they're all like, "Yeah, my endocrinologist is shocked." I'm like, "Yeah, your endocrinologist should have been the one to do it, right? The fact that they didn't is a massive problem."
Right. It is really the hard. It's so confusing for patients too, where I'm saying, these are the rules. Here's how you do this. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and fast for 36 or 48 hours. You are going to have a shift in how you eat. And over the next couple of weeks, your body is going to have the tolerance to go not just 2 hours or 3 hours between your meals, but closer to 6 or maybe even 8 hours between two feedings. And your blood sugar isn't going to drop into the abyss. It will drop, but not terribly. And I think, one of the places where I've circled to try and get experts to help me say, how do you explain this is, all right, so they've got a blood sugar of average of 115, not quite diabetic, but, enough to say you're going in the wrong direction. You've got, 4 cups of insulin instead of a half a cup. And when you drop the intake of blood sugar, carbohydrates, that insulin response to the cells, like how much insulin does it take to get that glucose into the cell? Well, it's going to follow the rules that you've set up over the last several months. And now you just changed the rules. So the glucose getting inside the cell is not as robust as what it was when your blood sugar was higher, when your signal of insulin was higher. And reversing that is uncomfortable. that especially that first step down of the blood sugar, where the insulin's still saying, I'm going to scream at you, but I don't have the signal to scream at you. So now the intracellular glucose is lower. And I think this is that difficult, like, reversal of insulin resistance that says, well, it isn't going to be a cakewalk there. Literally, it is going to have some seasons that you don't feel good. So when you're looking at insulin resistance, what kind of warnings do you give? Again, let's take that patient who's not quite maybe they just have an A1C as 6.7 or something, just enough to say, boy, oh boy, you're headed in the wrong direction. What label you want to put on it, we can decide. But going backwards, where do you land fasting, and how do you gauge their insulin resistance based on that?
I mean, I still mostly use the same A1Cs is the primary tool, only because it's the most easily available. Well, that, I mean, I measure fasting insulin and fasting C-peptide as well. Not all places can do that, but in Ontario we can. So I do monitor that as well. The other advantage of using blood glucose and glucose monitors is it's easily available and understandable to people. So therefore, that also is something that I usually talk to people about. But it's the same idea, right? You have to keep talking to them about it over and over, about resetting it. It's sort of like, if you listen to, if you're a teenager and you listen to loud music on your headphones, right? So then you get a little bit deaf, right? That's resistance, right? So you turn up the volume. That's a natural response. But that's actually the wrong thing to do, right? Because as you turn up the volume, it's going to give you more deafness. And then you're going to turn up the volume more, right? So what you think is clear and logical is not always clear and logical, because the thing you have to do, of course, is to sort of turn down the volume, take off the headphones, right? Same thing with the glucose, right? You think that, this is the trap that a lot of us had, right? Glucose is high, you give more insulin, right? This was the way we got taught. That is the way I learned it, the way everybody learned it. Oh, your glucose is high, here, take more insulin. That gives you more insulin resistance. That's what happened. So as you got more insulin resistant, your sugars went back up. Then you gave them more insulin and more insulin and more insulin. But it's a wrong thing to do, right? You actually have to, if your insulin is too high, you have to take away the insulin, to take out the carbs, or, other, or fast, or whatever way you want to do it. Then you need less insulin and less insulin and less insulin, as opposed to the other way around. And that's the trick. I mean, it's to keep talking to people about it. But for the most part, those standard measures are pretty. They're good because they're easily accessible, and most people will understand them quite easily because it's out there already.
Right. So if you look at that pattern recognition, that the longer you see patients, the more you can start to say that trajectory is going to be somebody who reverses their diabetes. This one, they're going to improve it, but it's not going to be reversible. Do you have some sort of like gut response, or something that you see when you're coaching patients to say, yes, your diabetes is reversible. Here's the footprint, decrease the carbs, add in fasting. But do you see a pattern of success that says that one's going to actually reverse it and that one isn't?
The one, most people I think are reversible, but there are a number of people who come to me, and I usually check the fasting insulin levels. And when it's not that high, like some of them are on the low normal side, which is completely out of keeping with type 2 diabetes. It often means that you may be dealing with like a latent onset type 1, which is interesting because that's not a dietary issue, right? So it's an autoimmune issue. So therefore the diet is not going to fix it. And that's the thing, because we get a lot of these highly motivated patients who really want to reverse it, who are like, they're relatively thin, and they're like, I can't believe I have type 2 diabetes. And why do I have type 2 diabetes? And it's like, okay, well, let's see. And it's like, it's not actual typical type 2 diabetes. And you see the same thing too with certain people will have type 2 diabetes. Like you see it during pregnancy, of course. And it's like, that's interesting because a lot of them, like if you're not diabetic before, but then you get it during pregnancy, it's a hormonal change, but the hormones is not insulin. The hormones is all of the sex hormones and stuff, right? So therefore that must also play a role, which is again, very under appreciated, that there's still something else going on much outside of what we know. Like it's not typical, but therefore you must be aware too that there are other instances, such as those people who have had gestational diabetes and stuff that manifested later, that it may not be a typical type 2 diabetes answer, where diet is the thing. So those people, you have to be careful. But for the most part, you're going to get the very sort of typical, people who are overweight, have been overweight, have very high insulins, whose diets are not optimal, right? In those cases, and there's a lot of them, then you can make a difference, right? And that's where, it's important, because the diet is the main things are there for. If you try and fix the diet, then you can make a big impact on these people.
So one of the parts that I find really helpful in my practice is that when you reverse this way of life, there's a lot of the addiction to the food, to the way you used to do things, this pattern that this is how you were raised, this is how you comforted yourself. Now we have this problem, we're trying to undo that. And we have to address some of the behavioral processes that are linked to your habits. And I, just like if you're trying to get rid of booze, having a support system of other people that are in the journey with you is very helpful. But let's say they have support systems and you're trying to guideline how quickly could you start fasting in a type 2 diabetic, and how what's the longest tell me what you put in the fast. I think I know your answer because I use the same one. And then what do you say the longest fast is they should do, or how often should they do it?
I don't put any any real restrictions on that. The main thing I tell them is make sure that they're safe. Because remember, they're on medications and therefore they do have the potential to go too low. Like your blood sugar can drop very low. If you're not on medications, then it's very unusual that your blood sugars will drop low because, that's not the way our body is designed. But if you are taking insulin or sulfonylureas, then there's a possibility that when you change your diet, that dose that was previously, reasonable for you, then is too much. And I always tell people, the main thing I tell people is that that's good. Usually it's insulin. That's the main one, right? So I'm like saying, you do have to watch your insulin dose because if you're getting better and you're still taking the same dose of insulin, that's going to be too much. You're basically overdosing on insulin, which is going to cause hypoglycemia, which is very dangerous. So therefore, being safe is of course the most important thing. And the CGMs have really made a big change in
totally.
this because they can monitor themselves much more closely than ever before, right? So as soon as it goes low, they'll know, and therefore you can extend these fasting periods, extend the duration, extend the frequency, while still knowing that you're keeping people safe. And that's really the important, it's an important thing that's come together to try and help these patients, right?
Yeah. So I do something that I think the future of medicine is going to have to involve when it comes to framing the improvement for patients. And that is, I lead a course twice a year that is essentially support groups of, using glucose and ketones to reverse these high blood sugars. And inside that course, we talk a lot about why some people can't get that blood sugar down below, I say triple digits, double digits. If you've got a morning fasting sugar that's north of 100, you've got plenty of stored sugar, you haven't had any food in 12 hours, you are in a group that says, we really do have you're not going to reverse this in 3 weeks. You have a season of life where reversing that insulin resistance, reversing that that pattern of glucose getting stored as glycogen. As soon as they lower it a little bit, the glycogen fills back up to what it used to be. And as they leave the course 3 weeks later with a better metabolism, what we talk about is, well, in order to reverse insulin resistance, we're trying to get you as long of a stint as possible without you binging back to previous behavior, like carbing out and really sending that blood sugar up high, which will, of course, reprime all of those beta cells with a bunch of insulin. And therefore, your insulin resistance is going to be really difficult when we see, just people, what we call falling off the wagon, time and time again, and they can't seem to really reverse that. They lose the first 60 pounds, but the final 30 pounds they're trying to get off is really stuck behind a wall that their behaviors keep sabotaging. So I sent you a slide deck that kind of showed you a couple of my cartoons trying to explain this to patients, that insulin resistance and reversing it is about this. It's a long game. But do you have any insight for how you teach patients when insulin resistance has just stalled out? They are stuck. They can't seem to lose weight. They are on a continuous glucose monitor. Their blood sugars hang out between 95 and 105. And I have my solutions, but I wonder what you do.
I usually tell people, like in terms of imagery, which I think is very important actually, to think of type 2 diabetes as essentially that their body is basically overflowing with glucose. So therefore, if they fast, then they're able to use up or burn off some of that glucose, or if they don't put more glucose in, then that's the whole idea, right? So then they get this idea that it's like an overflowing sink, right? It's like, well, you got to turn off the tap, but then you also got to open up the drain if you want to drain it all out, right? So there's two things that you have to really focus on: what you're putting in and what you're burning off, which is through the fasting. And it helps them sort of understand, okay, well, this is where it is. And it's like, if you're overflowing, if you've got so much already, then it can take a little while for it to come down, but at least they can see the progress that they're being made. So I tell them to focus on a couple of things, especially if they're on insulin. And it's the insulin dose, because if your sugars are better, but you're taking less insulin, then your disease is getting better. Not your blood glucose necessarily, because your blood glucose might stay the same, right? Some people have amazing, like they have a 6.0 blood glucose, but they're on like 80 units of insulin, right? It's like, well, you're only getting that A1C there because you're forcing all that glucose into your cells, right? And it's like same thing with the when they get the dawn effect, right? And it's like they ask me why. Well, just think about it. Where's that glucose coming from, right? It's your body simply releasing it. So this idea that it's sort of just this, you're just trying to account for all the glucose in their minds anyway, because visualization is important. Like, so that they have this idea, oh, okay, it's just about the glucose. And then they can say, okay, well, then they can see it in their foods. They can see it when they're fasting, that they're burning it. They can see it on their monitors. So that it helps them, right, to sort of say, okay, well, this is what's happening in here. And it's like, yes, maybe things are not great, but I know this, the way to get better. Sort of like, if you're trying to run a marathon, it's like, well, you start with 5K, then you move up to 10K, then you might move up, right? It's a step-by-step process, but at least you see that improvement. Same thing, you want to see the interim improvement, whether it's in your blood glucose or whether it's in your insulin dose or your medication dose or your waist circumference or whatever. It's important to see that sort of evidence that things are improving.
Well, it's very similar to what we teach in our team too, is that this is a long game. You're trying to level up from your last season of how good or bad, and I don't necessarily use those words, but how dramatically your blood sugar rises or lowers. So I think that a couple of final things that I would love to ask you, in the hot seat, meaning primary care, or yours is, kidney care, looking at patients that are front and center, aging beyond their years because of that high insulin state, that blood glucose. You get to see some of the most difficult. I shared before we started that my dad died of kidney failure, and peritoneal dialysis was. Oh, it was a heck of a season, where it's an intimate part of walking with someone's life. But I also think it changes us as people, that when we watch what are the consequences of a high insulin life, and how can we not do that for ourselves and our families? So would you feel comfortable sharing what do you do in the world of fasting? And then I think you have teenagers. Do they fast, or do you let them have processed carbs?
Yeah, I don't necessarily restrict it. We just simply talk about, what are foods that are good for you and bad for you. Not that you necessarily can't ever eat them, because I don't think that that's necessary.
You don't actually have teenagers if you think you can control all that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I mean, the thing is that there's all sorts of other influences, right? So you just want to make sure that they understand what's happening, so that they ultimately you can't control what they do. They're going to move out of the house. They're going to make their own choices. If you are too strict on them, and this always happens, right? If you're very strict on them, then the minute they move out, they go crazy on the other stuff. And I don't know that that's better. Like, you see this sort of freshman 5, or now it's the freshman 15 and stuff, right? So I'm not that restrictive on them in terms of what they can eat or even when they can eat, but they know what is
they've heard the language,
proper way,
right?
and yeah, exactly, and what's not the proper way, and that kind of stuff, right? And that's as best as you can do. But the whole idea is just to give them the right knowledge, so that they can, if they do run into a problem, then at least they have a base on which they can say, oh, I know my problem. I'm drinking too much alcohol and too much soda, and I'm doing it all the time, right? So that if they recognize that there is a problem, because, a lot of times you have to recognize that there's a problem. If they don't have a problem, then they're not going to listen to you anyway, right? So once they get that problem, then they can say, okay, well, I know the problem. It's this. Right, which is important, because if it's too much sodas and too much alcohol and that stuff, then they can cut it out. Whereas if you think it's about too many calories, they could say, well, I'll take the alcohol and soda and not eat my vegetables, right? Or not eat my salmon, right? I'll have a couple of drinks for dinner. I mean, I remember, the advice. I've heard this advice. I saw it actually one of these books by the American Diabetes Association, and it had some doctor, and it was like, you can have ice cream for dinner. I'm like, oh, that's the worst advice I've ever heard, right? That's just terrible, terrible advice. But there was, it was like, oh, because it's 500 calories. So if you want to splurge and just have ice cream for dinner, it's like, no, you should never do that. Right? Like you can do it, but you have to know that that's bad, right? If you know it's bad and you still make that decision, that's your decision, right? I'm okay with that, but don't pretend it's a good decision or a reasonable decision. So you just have to let them know, and that's where I kind of come down on things because it's a long life, and it's not like you should never have sugar, sort of thing, right? It's like you shouldn't have too much sugar, and if you're sick, you should definitely cut it out, but for other people, it seems reasonable that once in a while they should be able to enjoy
And
ice
I put a
cream.
lot of weight on the fact that they watch, my husband and I, and watch what our behaviors are. And that's going to be the list of options that comes to mind first is what they've seen in life. So do you fast on a regular basis, or how do you have an hour that you quit eating by, or some kind of pattern of food behavior that you hope your kids copy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't eat breakfast most of the time. Not that I think it's necessarily right or wrong, but it works the easiest in my situation. Yeah, and I've done it for a long time. That's why I do that because it was always I was just didn't ever, yeah, I was always rushing. So then instead of eating something, I just skip it and then go right to lunch. And I just got into the habit of that. But that's what I do sort of regularly. It actually makes life a lot easier, I have to say. Like the fewer meals you eat, the less time. Like you're just, yeah, because, it's like, um, it's just one whole, preparing, cooking, eating, cleaning cycle that you're avoiding. And the problem with breakfast is not that breakfast is bad for you. It's just that breakfast is a rush. And so people will usually go for the easiest, most processed, breakfast cereal style food, right? No cleanup, no cooking, but not good for you
Not good for
anyway,
you.
right? So that's where I sort of do that. I mostly do that most of the days, actually. Sometimes I will eat breakfast, and that's fine. And then most of the time I don't eat lunch because then, you get into these habits. And that's the thing about habits is that once you develop the habit, it takes no willpower. So sometimes I'll eat breakfast because we're going out for breakfast or, the hotel will have breakfast included. Then I won't eat lunch, right? Because I'm just too full. I just can't do it, right? It's not that I want to skip lunch, but I just really can't eat. Once I eat the breakfast, I really can't take anything, but that's because of the habit. So once you develop the habit, it takes some willpower. And that's why it's really important to develop those good habits, because that's what's going to sustain you. It's not the willpower that sustains you, it's your habits that sustain
Oh,
you,
it's such a
right?
big
Just like
deal.
brushing your teeth, right?
Yes.
It's like you brush your teeth because it's a habit, not because you think about it every day. But that's what sustains you. If you had to think about it every day, oh, shoot, I need to go brush my teeth. But you don't. You don't even think about it. Morning time, go brush your teeth. Evening time, go brush your teeth. Sustains you. You don't expend any willpower doing it, right? Same thing with good habits. So if you develop a habit of cutting out snacks and, dropping one meal and eating twice a day, well, that's what sustains you because that's what your normal is, right? But since your normal is already good, it helps, right?
Well, you have summarized. We could write the same book. The amount of advice and the amount of life that comes with logic, but also I think it's the art of actually seeing patients too. That you can have a strict set of rules, and I mean, we do our best to kind of really help people hone in behaviors, especially in those intense classes that we do only twice a year because it wears out the rest of us too. That the class is live and but pretty powerful at reversing health problems. And I will just say thank you for being one of the specialists that also agrees there's reversal of these problems, that there is some disconnect when specialists say it's not possible. I think that's very difficult for patients to hear. So I appreciate your authoritative voice really ringing through the ears of many people that we help with saying, no, no, no. It's not easy. It's not going to happen in 30 minutes or 3 weeks, but it is possible if you stay the course. And I appreciate your authority and the support you give to all the patients, as well as the space of reversing these health problems.
Thank you so much.
You bet.